You're listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast presented by Smead Capital Management. At Smead Capital Management, we advise investors who fear stock market failure. You can learn more at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.
Welcome to A Book with Legs podcast. We put together some extra bonus content from our discussion from Cage Kings by Michael Thomsen, episode 218, where he taught us the history of the UFC, the media around it, and the fighters' pains and successes. We're going to call this episode 218.2. It's really the first time we've done this. To give you a little background for the guests we're having on today, last spring I was at church for our Wednesday night men's group that we call Real Men. Our guest for this discussion spoke at that. And after hearing his story and reading Cage Kings, and just so you know, Matt, in fairness, I wasn't going to go that night to church. My wife told me I had to. I heard your story and I read Cage Kings and I said, you know what, we needed to have Matt on A Book with Legs. So I would love to welcome Matt, the lawyer, Lindland, to join us to talk about his path to the Olympics, to UFC, to the Supreme Court. And we also talk about what you're doing now and what that was like during the pandemic. So Matt, glad you could be here with me.
Cole, thanks for having me. And the law, but the lawyers.
Oh yeah, sorry, the law. Sorry, my bad. And we'll talk about that because the law is you are definitely a man of the law. So to make sure our tribe is familiar with you, I'm just going to go a little bit around your background, not too much because I don't want to steal any of the thunder of our conversation, but to give our audience a background. Matt won a national title while at Clackamas Community College before attending the University of Nebraska, where he went 33-1 his senior year and won the Big 8 title. Matt wrestled freestyle and Greco-Roman before focusing on Greco-Roman for the 2000 Summer Olympics, where he won the silver medal. His first UFC match was UFC 29. Matt has also coached the U.S. national wrestling team at the 2016 Rio Olympics and the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. So Matt, first off, you know, I had friends that wrestled in high school and whatnot. You know, there's a particular kind of young man that loves wrestling. And so I'd love to hear, like, what got you into wrestling? What was that thing that just suddenly made you say, this is my game?
Oh, it's a great story because I was never involved. I grew up as a pretty rural boy, riding ponies and jumping horses. I was an equestrian athlete, and I was pretty accomplished in the sport until my mother told me that we could no longer afford for me to ride horses and continue on that path.
Okay.
And you've got the athletes like Springsteen's daughter that are well funded that are able to participate in those kind of sports. So I had taken a couple wrestling classes at my junior high, 7th and 8th grade year, just for like 6 weeks, and kind of didn't really think about it until I got into high school, and it was required in our gym class for freshman boys. And the coach convinced me that I was really good and I had a lot of potential. And I'm sure he was just trying to get me to come out for participation numbers. But that was really the start of my wrestling career. And then after the high school season, I did something called freestyle and Greco-Roman, which are the two international styles that are competed in the Olympic Games. And I went 0-8 in that first weekend of doing international style of wrestling. Mm-hmm. And what I found out was I needed to get to a club and surround myself with quality athletes and good coaches. And I was blessed enough to wind up in a wrestling club that in 1985 featured the coach from the 1984 Olympic team, Pavel Katzin. And Pavel was a former Soviet coach and had moved over to the United States to coach the U.S. team in the 84 Olympic Games.
So you get going with him, and again, you know, you hadn't had any success your first go at it without, you know, good coaching. Was it high school wrestling where this really got going for you and you started to see a lot of success?
I wouldn't say I was really successful in high school or even post-high school. I was not recruited to, you know, any major colleges, so I ended up going to a community college that was in my hometown. Clackamas Community College. I ended up, you know, coaching there and helping the team out as well later in my career. But we had a pretty successful program at Clackamas Community College, but nothing outstanding. I did win a national title, and then I was recruited to multiple Division I programs, and ultimately I decided to choose the University of Nebraska.
So as I think about it, to this day, the was the Big 8, now the Big 12, and if God knows how college football is going to change, it might be the Big 28 someday. But the Big 12 has really been a powerhouse wrestling conference. So to go to the University of Nebraska, that's not just any Division I program. That's the best conference in America to go wrestling.
Yeah, that was, if I'm going to do this, I was going to definitely try to get into the best program I could, surround myself with the best competition, put myself right in the heart of, wrestling country, where people do this sport.
Sure. So and around that time, you run into Randy Couture.
Yeah, I met Randy my junior year. It was my first year at the University of Nebraska, and he was an athlete at Oklahoma State who was one of our rivals, but we got to know each other then, and then we competed on national teams together and trained together for years.
So then, you're in the wrestling community, you're in the wrestling world, you're at a strong school. What was the first time, as you read Cage Kings, I read Cage Kings. My first introduction to MMA was 2006. I went to go see my brother at the University of New Mexico, and he said, "Hey, there's a UFC fight on tonight. Let's go to Buffalo Wild Wings." And I had never been, seeing a UFC fight, so I thought, sure, let's go. And we get there, and in Albuquerque, in '06, this is like the biggest game in town, because in Albuquerque, like, there's no pro sports teams, like most major cities. And we get there, and it's like, this is fight night. This is a major social event where we were at. And so that was my introduction. What was the first time you saw it live?
Yeah, I'm sure it was pretty big in Albuquerque. You got Jackson's MMA and a lot of top-ranked
a lot of houses there.
Came out of that program. Well, I grew up watching boxing and fight sports and with my mom, and then when I got to college, I had a rowdy bunch of teammates that always loved to watch Tyson fight in that era.
Yeah.
And this fight came on in '93, and we were just super psyched to watch this fight and see what this was about. And I was intrigued from the first time I saw it.
But did you know then that you're like, hey, I'm gonna do that? Like that's where I'm going, or was that just like, wow, that was really cool? What was the feeling you had? Because obviously that was kind of shaping your path, but did you know it at the time?
No, I thought, wow, that's really cool. I thought it was a one-off event for sure. I didn't think this was something you could do as a post-college career. For sure, and I absolutely had Olympic aspirations. I had set some goals to compete in the Olympic Games and represent my country in the Olympics. And so I hadn't really thought too much about it at that point, other than, wow, this is really interesting, until I started seeing guys like Randy Couture and other teammates of mine start to fight in these events.
Sure. So you get out of Nebraska in '93, and then you talk about going to the Olympics, which you did do, but I butchered your name. You being the Law, there's a reason why they call you the Law, and that was a process for you. So could you kind of walk us from '93 getting out of college to eventually being in the Olympics in 2000?
Well, yeah, that's a very long story, but I'll try to condense it for you. '93, I finished at the University of Nebraska, and I think you read my record. What was it, like 34-1 or something?
33-1. Yeah, your senior year.
33-1. And we were done at Nebraska. My wife and I and our youngest son, or my oldest son. My daughter wasn't born at this time, so we moved back to our home in Oregon. But the training opportunities in Oregon were not what they were when there was other athletes that were pursuing Olympic aspirations in wrestling. So
sure.
Ultimately, I got invited by Mike Houck, who was the national team coach, to move to Colorado Springs and be a part of the inaugural resident athlete program in Colorado Springs.
Okay.
And my daughter was about 2 weeks from being delivered, and so I told Mike, as soon as my daughter's 2 weeks old, we'll move out there. And
okay.
So about a month later, I was in Colorado Springs training there at the Olympic Training Center. But it's a pretty hard path because you got to fund all your living expenses. And now I had 2 children and a wife, so my part-time job was driving the Zamboni after training all day until about midnight or 2 in the morning.
Yeah.
It was a pretty rough path, and during that same time, we had a coaching staff change, and we went from a transformational coach to a more of a transactional coach, and it just wasn't the fit for me as it was for the same guy, for the guy that recruited me out there, Mike Hauk, and then I had a different coach. It was just a different feel. And so I ultimately got a job offer to coach at the University of Nebraska. And my coaches out there said they were going to help me prepare for the Olympic Games. And I had a really generous club that would sponsor training partners to come train with me or send me to Europe for training opportunities and competition. That was a Sunkist Kids Wrestling Club. And so for the next, after I missed making the '96 Olympic team that was in Atlanta, I went as an alternate for the Olympic Games and was even more inspired to, make a team in 2000. And I made every team, the World Championship teams from 97, 98, 99, all those years. And in 99, I was practically on the podium until I busted my elbow out and tore a pronator teres muscle and had to get that repaired, thinking that this was probably the worst timing ever. It was a year before the Olympic Games and the qualifying tournaments for the Olympics. So I needed to go qualify the weight class for the Olympic Games. And I had this torn muscle in my arm that was just, recently repaired. But ultimately, I ended up going to Cali, Colombia, and beat Nestor Almanza, who was a world champion, because the year before I'd beat the other Cuban at that weight class, who ended up being a 2-time Olympic champion, Filberto Esqui, won the games in '96, and he ultimately went down a weight class because I'd beaten him a couple times prior to that. So I think he thought his best chance to qualify was at 68 kilos, and I ended up wrestling another guy that was a world champion to qualify that weight class. And I made the team, and then I went to the Olympic trials thinking, I'm wrestling a guy that I've beaten 13 times in a row. I should, be able to perform pretty good to make the team. It was just a formality, really, until the matches were completely misjudged, and it just felt really eerie and odd. And then I followed the procedure set up by the organizing committee, which was USA Wrestling at the time, and they refused to follow their own rules, which I filed a protest to review the film, and they said that they refused to review the film, so they denied me due process. And there was nowhere in the rules that they could deny me due process. So ultimately, I took the case to the Greco-Roman Sport Committee, which they started pulling members off the sport committee. And you mentioned Randy Couture's name. He was actually one of the members on the sport committee that got removed. And the reasoning for removing members was because they have bias. Well, as humans, we all have bias, and that's why you have committees. Yeah. That's why you have committees and multiple people. So again, I was denied due process. And then ultimately I went to an arbitrator, and it was final and binding, and I re-wrestled the match and beat the athlete 9-0 in the re-wrestle match. And I was not put on the Olympic team because they wanted to re-arbitrate the case and get a different ruling.
Effectively buying off time so that you would run out of time.
That was essentially what it was. So I ended up getting an injunction from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that kind of forced USA Wrestling's hand in the Olympic Committee to name me to the Olympic team. And ultimately, I went to Australia and was training and preparing. I walked in the opening ceremonies, and then I found out they were appealing it again in an International Court of Arbitration for Sport. And they woke up this judge from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and he said, frankly, you guys beat me. I have no jurisdiction outside the United States, but if you ever plan on returning to the United States, I will have air marshals at the airport waiting to arrest you. So, do what you must do. But and during this time, the case was upheld by the United States Supreme Court as well. So I think everything, worked out in the favor that it should. And 4 days later, I had to compete in the Olympic Games and ultimately made it to the finals and lost to Murat Kardanov from Russia in the Olympic finals.
I've yet to meet an athlete that can say they won a silver medal and got to go to the Supreme Court. That is you by far more interesting conversation with strangers than I'll ever have. So when did MMA start for you?
While I was training for the Olympics.
Okay.
I got an opportunity in 1997. I took that opportunity and took 3 fights and just absolutely loved the sport. And it wasn't MMA at that time. It was no holds barred. There was
no rules.
There was literally 3 rules. You couldn't bite, you couldn't gouge somebody's eye out, and you couldn't attack them in the groin. And I just really enjoyed this, but what I recognized was if I were to continue to pursue this sport, that I would really be distracted from reaching my goals in wrestling. Mm-hmm. So I took those 3 fights, won a tournament, and just said, you know what, I'm going to focus on the Olympic Games. And that was probably what made it really hard when I decided to focus on the games, and then, making the team, qualifying in the weight class for the United States, and then still trying to get pushed off the Olympic team made it really hard for me. So after the Olympics, I basically was just like done. I was like completely done with USA Wrestling, and then I realized that we were supposed to have the World Championships in New York City in September in 2001, and so I took a break from fighting and came back to the sport of wrestling. And the games did not happen in New York in September 2001 because yeah, exactly.
9/11.
So.
Yep.
Right. So the World Championships were postponed till December, and ultimately moved up a weight class and came home with another silver medal for the United States. But I had started my fighting career already at that time with the former owners of the UFC, which was SEG.
Yeah, Semaphore Entertainment Group. Yeah.
Yeah.
The original creator. So in UFC 29, was Semaphore still the owner when you fought in UFC 29?
Yes.
Okay, so they were the owner, and so then at what point, in your fighting career with the UFC, did it change over? Because I don't have the dates here in front of me, because you were in 29, 31, 34. Was it in those first 3 fights?
It changed over in 30, and I fought in the first sanction. I fought in the first sanctioned fight in Trump Taj Mahal in 31.
Which was the first one that the Fertittas owned the production?
No, it was the second one. They bought it after 29. They held a provisionally sanctioned event in New Jersey and then got it sanctioned, and I fought in the first sanctioned event.
Gotcha. Okay. So, can you teach us a little bit of the inside baseball? I mean, Semaphore had been running it, as Michael talked about in his book. Semaphore was they were running out of leash with the regulators in each of these states, the boxing commissions, the fighting commissions, etc. What was it like to watch to go, you fought and won with Semaphore, you end up fighting under the Fertittas. Was there a big change just as a fighter in those productions, or was that just kind of not much change, just the owners as you witnessed it?
Early on, not much change. Right when things happened, it wasn't a lot of change until maybe another year later, and they started getting their bearings and understanding how to run these shows, and then it became all about contracts and negotiations. And I mean, I showed up to fight. I was supposed to be on a main card. I got relegated to an undercard because I refused to sign an addendum to my Well, I didn't refuse to sign it. They handed me an addendum to a contract on a Tuesday, and I was fighting on Saturday. And they said, "Oh, hey, I need you to sign this addendum to your contract." I said, "Okay."
So this would be like Dana White would be coming to you and saying, here's your addendum, or would that be the Fertittas themselves, or who would be coming to you with that?
No, it was just the people in the office handing me a paper going, hey, you need to sign this. And I'm like, this is a contract. I'm going to have an attorney look at this. And Dana was like, you need to sign it now. And I was like, okay, as soon as my attorney gets back to me. I mean, the fight's on Saturday night, buddy. We got time to do this. And ultimately, it was about sponsors. And I got paid $15,000 to show for that fight and $15,000 to win. My sponsor was paying me $30,000, and they were trying to remove my sponsor from that fight. And ultimately, I did not violate the regulations of of their new contract. I was very careful. I called my sponsor and said, "Hey, here's what they're telling me to do." They said, "Okay, don't worry about it. Just wear the merchandise around the event and anything that's not in the ring." And so I did that. And then ultimately I was released the next Monday after that fight from that contract. I was hired back and then released again, and then ultimately Dana tried to hire me a third time, and I was like, I was out at that time. So that's a story in itself right there.
Well, because I think, Michael talked a lot about how effectively those outside sponsorships were present in UFC, and then anything inside the ring became the exclusive control, really, of UFC, where it was effectively taking the money out of the pocket of the fighters and putting like a little bit of money in their pocket, but not much, because obviously they were taking the lion's share of the sponsorship dollars inside that ring.
Absolutely. I mean, most sports athletes get about 50%, and we're under 20 still to this day. I think UFC athletes are still under like 20% of their net revenue. So
and he points out that I think if you look at the overall cash flow of the business, they're 20%. It's 40% would be more typical for more sports leagues. So because let's see, so I guess we mentioned Dana a little bit. Was it that contentious to deal with Dana, or was Dana actually a fun guy to be around from time to time?
No, he was very contentious. He was he was a bully. I mean, he was just an absolute bully. And I mentioned early in the conversation how I had a coaching staff change, and Dana reminded me a lot of coaches I've worked with before that are just like, this is how you're going to do it, and it's like, okay, I don't need you around me, I'll do it my way. And as a subcontractor, I mean, you're a 1099 employee,
Yeah,
it's
no
not like
health
you're an
benefits,
employee.
by the way. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right?
no
you
health benefits, no retirement, there's nothing. And same thing with USA Wrestling. There was no benefits, no health. I mean, you were a 1099 employee all the time.
Yeah. So, what were your interactions with Joe Rogan then? I mean, because he became the color guy not long after the Fertittas changeover, and he was just kind of from what Michael said, he was just a natural fan of the sport, and that's what it gave him a lot of his enjoyment for calling matches, was that he actually enjoyed it. Was Joe a completely different interaction compared to Dana?
Well, I mean, he didn't have any, ownership role. Joe is a fun guy for sure to be around. He's definitely not my type of individual. He's very. I think he's coming around. I've listened to some of his podcasts and stuff, or at least other podcasters that cover him and talk about him being, open more to the gospel. But he was very anti-Jesus type of guy, like almost hostile towards the gospel. But, I mean, he was a guy you could have dinner with and have a good conversation with.
Sure.
My wife went away from one dinner going, that guy hates women, doesn't he? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, it sounded like it, sweetheart.
I was going to say, I think something, I don't think this went into the book, which, by the way, before I forget, I will forget this. I brought up your name to Michael and, didn't know if, I assume he knew of you, but didn't know. And he spoke very highly of you, and I mentioned we were going to do this extra content with him, and he mentioned that you actually got edited out of the book. So as soon as I found that out, I thought, okay, we further need to have Matt on, because if this is something that would have normally been in the unedited edition, I have to throw it in. By the way, on that note, I think one of the better, more interesting recent podcasts I picked up was one of Joe Rogan's discussions. Let's see, it was actually about kind of questioning evolution. And it was interesting, to your point, someone like Joe Rogan, that you don't exactly expect someone to be like receptive to asking the question, is science right, or is evolution right? Or, he had just an incredibly interesting discussion. So I don't disagree with you. I think as time changes, it's interesting to see how some of his content and topic and discussions have moved further right, or to your point, like there's probably more likely there's a God. Much more interesting. So let's see, what was the most, I was looking at over all the places you fought. What of the venues you go to, what was the most interesting venue you ever fought, either because the city was great or just because you got there and it's not what you expected for fans?
I would definitely have to go with St. Petersburg. When I fought Fedor Emelianenko, who was the number one heavyweight at the time, not in the UFC. I was the number one middleweight, not in the UFC, even though UFC runs their own rankings. The rest of the world had us both ranked number one in the world at our respective weights. So I moved up 2 weight classes, and not only did I fight in that event, I got invited to the presidential palace after the fight and had an evening with Vladimir Putin and at that time Prime Minister of Italy, Bernicelli. And for some weird reason, Jean-Claude Van Damme was there at the dinner as well.
Blood sport in the living, right?
Yeah, I know. I love St. Petersburg as it is, and I was there for 10 days, and 8 of them was direct sunlight, which is like, you get like 10 days a year direct sunlight in St. Petersburg. So it was an interesting place to go. I enjoy traveling, and especially in Russia. That's a really interesting spot because they love combative athletes. It's just part of their culture.
So while you're training for the UFC in the early 2000s, you re-engage your relationship with Randy, and you guys start Team Quest. Did you just have trouble finding a good gym?
No, what happened was we kind of skipped. So I went back to coach at the University of Nebraska while I was training for the Olympics. Immediately after I got home from the Olympic Games, I had moved. We had a coaching staff change at the University of Nebraska. I was hired, then my job was given to somebody else, and I was just like, okay, well, I'll leave, but they owed me some money, which was at that time a pretty substantial amount of money. It was $8,000 for work that I'd already done. So I had to go back to Lincoln to get paid and to move my family.
Yeah.
And I'd already moved my wife and my kids to Oregon, and I had them staying with friends and family while they came to the Olympics, but while I was in training camp, we were basically homeless, so until after the Olympic Games. I went back and moved my family's possessions and started a car business in the same town that kind of my hometown, but where Randy was currently training. They lost the lease on their business, which was a small like boutique gym that they were running, and they said they needed a place to train, and I had a car lot, and we rolled some mats down in our garage, and we just started training together.
Interesting. So then you came back, like you mentioned, you coached in Nebraska, but then you also came back later and you coached Team USA. I was going to ask you, what was it like to go from being the athlete to being the coach for these athletes? Because obviously you had a strange experience, as you laid out earlier, in your Olympic career. What was that like as, this person that had to fight the politics of it versus being the coach in the middle of it?
I had always coached. My first coaching job was in '93 when I moved back after college. I coached another athlete who ended up being a pretty popular UFC fighter in high school wrestling, which was Chael Sonnen. I was also, coaching at a couple different clubs, trying to make ends meet while I was training there. But ultimately, the training situation wasn't ideal. That's why I moved to Colorado. And then that wasn't ideal, and so I moved back to Nebraska. And then at this time, we'd started a business, and my wife and I were working at our car lot, and I trained athletes that were fighting in the UFC. I trained wrestlers. I've always coached. I've always worked with athletes. So I think it was a natural progression when that job opened, and the coach that held that position for over 2 decades retired from that. It was a natural fit for me to go in there, but my approach was definitely build relationships first. Connect before you can correct. You've got to build these relationships with athletes so you have trust and buy-in. And we were having a lot of success. We hit some milestones in our sport that have never been accomplished before. Number of junior and cadet world medalists, so that's under 17 and under 20. And statistically speaking, you start getting athletes to win at 17, 18, 19 years old. These athletes can start winning medals at the senior level, Olympic medals, by the time they're 20, 21. So just setting the program up for success, and but really doing it in a way that has never been done before in the United States, more of a European style model.
Gotcha. So you're always, like as you point out, while you were an athlete, you were coaching, you're kind of a man of many projects as I look at you. So I'd love to just kind of ask, what are your projects you're in right now?
Well, my main project right now is getting my gym back to where it's profitable, where we're making a lot of, making money and giving opportunities for especially youth. I live in Portland, Oregon. We passed something called Measure 110, which legalized every drug known to man, and we have a huge homeless problem. We have a poverty problem, and it used to be downtown Portland was the most highest density neighborhood in the city. It's now the neighborhood that my gym's in the middle of, and it's really become a place where kids can learn to build confidence and self-esteem. And I've created a nonprofit, the Father's Heart Combat Sports, where I use a long-term athlete development model, where I expose athletes to jiu-jitsu, wrestling, boxing, kickboxing, all forms of martial arts, and let them kind of choose their path. I have a lot of athletes that have chosen to go the college wrestling route because there's a lot of opportunities to get degrees and in college while they're competing.
Sure.
But I have other athletes that are more interested in looking at an MMA route, but also, jiu-jitsu competition. There's just a lot of opportunities, but really it's just getting these young men and into the gym and helping them build their confidence and their skills at the same time.
Well, yeah, and I think the other thing between hearing your story at church as well as hearing reading Michael's book is a lot of these athletes get done with college and are great wrestlers and they have nothing left, right? Like, what do you do next? What's your encore? And that's what the one thing that MMA has provided is where they could take their skills and do greater things, in a professional format beyond, to your point, the Olympics. The other thing too, and I want to honor you in this, Matt, the storytelling you did when I got to hear you live, I think, what you do for young men and, what you create in structure and how you're leading them, I think is, something to be applauded. And I thank you a lot for that, because I think in this world, like to your point, rampant drug use, cities falling apart, leading young men is our only way out of this. So I thank you for that. I was going to ask you, where can people follow you going forward, Matt? Like what's the ways for people to keep tabs on you, what you're up to, what the projects you're in?
Okay. My gym is Team Quest Mixed Martial Arts. And my Instagram is Lindland, and probably the best place though would be my YouTube. I've got one of my young athletes that's putting up content for me. He's filming me coaching and putting up videos of here's how to execute a takedown. Here's how to, turn your opponent and score points. Just different opportunities, and that's on Coach Matt Lindland's YouTube channel. So that's a great place. We are building a website for the nonprofit, the Father's Heart Sports. That is not up yet. I just filed with the state. I've got all the legal work. There's a ton of processes that go on building a nonprofit, and then comes to raising the funds. There's a lot of things that need to be done, and this was my 1 week, my vacation. I've been back in Portland running my gym for 1 year, and I decided to take a week off, and I'm down here at the coast in Oregon in the northwest corner of our state, fishing salmon in the Columbia River.
That's awesome. I think I mentioned to you, but I have family from that neck of the woods, and my dad sent me a text. They were out salmon fishing. I think they went out Ilwaco today. So, so very cool. So Matt, I really appreciate this. It's been tons of fun. Thank you for your time today. Like I said to our audience, this was exclusive bonus content for A Book with Legs, episode 218. We're calling it 218.2. If you enjoy this podcast, go to Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to A Book with Legs. Give us a review, tell others about the books, great authors, and guests like Matt the Law Lindland to help build our worldly wisdom. For our tribe, if you have a great book that you'd like to recommend, email podcast@smeedcap.com. That's podcast@smeedcap.com. You can also send your suggestions to us on Twitter. Our handle is @SmeedCap. Thank you for joining us for A Book with Legs podcast. We look forward to the next episode.
Thank you for listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast brought to you by Smeed Capital Management. The material provided in this podcast is for informational use only and should not be construed as investment advice. You can learn more about Smeed Capital Management and its products at smeedcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.